Listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, welcome to the webinar, Can My Foundation Fund Legal Aid? I'm Laura Kowinski and I'm a member of the policy and legal team here at the Council on Foundations, and if there are any community foundations on the phone, I'm sure you know me as the Director of National Standards. I'm excited to be here today with you and with our speakers as we talk about the ins and outs of funding legal aid. Just a quick note about why are we bringing you this topic and why now. Over the last 6 weeks or so, as you know, spring can be a very busy conference season. And again, we heard foundations at numerous conferences talking about how to handle issues in their communities and what are some of the best tools. Over and over again, we heard you all talking about legal aid, civil, criminal, can I fund it, can I not? What would it mean? What would it look like? And so today we're bringing you some of your peers to talk about what they're doing in the legal aid space, specifically civil legal aid. And then we're going to get into a peer discussion if you all have questions or you want to talk about the work that you're doing. After we talk today, we will record this webinar and we'll also have the Philanthropy Exchange open to Council on Foundation members to continue the communications. We'll make the slides available because they do contain resources, and we'll make those available to all of today's attendees. Thank you so much for joining us, and without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Mary McClimate, President of the Public Welfare Foundation.
Thank you very much, Laura, and good afternoon to everybody. I'm delighted to be here with you today and want to thank the Council for organizing this session for us. You know, since 2011, the Public Welfare Foundation has been doing a grant-making program on advancing civil legal aid for low-income people. And my job today here is to start with a bit of an overview on what do we mean by civil legal aid. And we wanted to start with some fast facts so that we all might get together on the same page for purposes of this call. I guess I'd just start by saying I know all of you have heard on your favorite TV shows such as Law and Order, you've heard the promise that if you can't afford a lawyer, one will be provided for you. Well, that is true for criminal cases, but it is not true for civil cases where there is no constitutional right to a lawyer to represent you. And what do I mean by civil cases? For example, a mother and her child are being evicted from their home, a veteran is losing his benefits, an abused woman needs to get protection, an elderly person is losing access to his health care. Now, these are matters, as you all can recognize, that are of great significance to a person's life. It threatens economic and personal survival. And so think about it, without legal help in these kinds of situations, these kind of problems can really escalate and families can get torn apart or fall further down the economic ladder. So let's go to our next slide. What is civil legal aid? The way we're defining it for our call today is really a combination of services and resources that help people effectively navigate the civil justice system, all those civil cases I was mentioning. Civil legal aid, as you see from this slide, helps people in all types of situations. As you see here, we've got many issues. We've got many types of people that can be helped by civil legal aid. Just wanted you to take a glance at that. And all of our speakers will be talking more about examples from these areas as we move forward in the call. So let's go to our next slide. Where are services found in the community? You know, there are a group of anchor organizations, you might call them, for these types of services. They're a set of community-based legal aid groups that operate all across the country. Often they are supplemented by pro bono assistance, free assistance by members of the bar in the community or from free legal clinics at law schools. But they're also supplemented by what we call self-help services, which are increasingly found in our courts and even in our libraries. So civil legal aid actually is a very interesting field which is on the move. There's a lot of new innovations and ways of expanding services for people who have these needs, whether it's technology tools, medical legal partnerships, providing services through these self-help centers. So let's talk about what legal aid lawyers actually do for people. They, give one-on-one advice and guidance. They actually go to court with people and provide them representation. They can help community groups in all the advocacy efforts they might be undertaking in the local community. And they also pursue policy reforms. And I think the really important thing to remember is that many of the encounters involving civil legal aid absolutely do not involve litigation. It's oftentimes about advice and counsel and figuring out how to help people navigate their legal problem. Civil legal aid really is a set of problem solvers. Now, in the next slide, we wanted to highlight who funds legal aid. Some legal aid groups get federal government support through the Legal Services Corporation that was set up to help low-income people with legal help. Now, unfortunately, the Legal Services Corporation funding is roughly just half of what it was in the mid-90s when you adjust for inflation. So the funding is very limited. In some states, groups actually can get some support at the state level through what is known as IOLTA programs, or interest off of lawyers pooling client dollars that is held in escrow, and money is made available through that for legal aid. In some places, state legislatures are actually stepping up and providing help. And in some other places, individual donors and foundations are helping out. So you might say to yourself, well, job done. That's a lot of funding. Story ends. Not so. Unfortunately, there are 65 million people in our country who are poor or low income and eligible for civil legal aid. But the sad truth is that numerous studies estimate that as much as 80% of serious legal needs of low income people go absolutely unmet because there's such insufficient funding. We also need to remember there's a big crisis in our state courts, and I think it's shocking to people when they hear this, but it affects both low and moderate income people. In the courts, there are actually, again, 80% of all those civil cases I was referring to earlier, where at least one of the parties, either the plaintiff or the defendant, goes completely unrepresented. That is to say, they have no lawyer at all. So in short, there's a lot of new exciting services and ways to help people with their legal problems, but there is not enough funding and real support for legal aid. So let's move on to Ken. I just wanted to lay out some of the basic facts for you first.
Thank you very much, Mary. And hi, everyone. My name is Ken Goldsmith. I work at the American Bar Association, and I want to start off by saying how happy I am to be here at your proverbial table. I would be remiss not to thank Laura Kowalski and the Council on Foundations for assembling this program. Laura and I met through our work in support of military veterans, their families, and caregivers, but it didn't take long for us to see how the lessons there were readily applicable to other areas as well. So again, kudos, and thank you to all who dialed in to be a part of today. I also want to let you know that today's panel, in my experience, represents a real who's who of the problem solvers. So I'm really looking forward to what we might all cover together. First, I want to mention a word about my employer. We are by no means the only organization in this space, but we are perhaps the largest. We are a voluntary trade association for somewhere between 350 and 400,000 members on any given count, working in more than 3,500 entities of different sizes, representing all sides of most any legal issue you might imagine. We are also concerned about things beyond the law itself, like how accessible the courts are for everyday people, and how innovations in legal services will help deliver the maximum impact of legal services to the public. We do this because as part of our mission, we care about the administration of justice and the enjoyment and enforcement of the rights and remedies available to all people under law. We share this mission with many other partners at the national, state, and local levels, including bar associations, which I should clarify are independent and not chapters of the ABA, but with whom we do work closely. One of the chief ways our mission is made real is through the support of pro bono and other free legal services, as Mary outlined, especially for those who are in crisis and cannot afford a lawyer of their own. We do that through freestanding projects at the ABA, like the Military Pro Bono Project, or in partnership with other and local providers. These hands-on projects serving veterans, homeless, undocumented immigrant children, the elderly, survivors of domestic violence, and even public education is frequently through the generous support of funders through our 501c3 program fund, the ABA Fund for Justice and Education. Some of you may have been or are supporting projects through FJE now, and for which I thank you. So the support you give doesn't support things you don't want to support if you give to the ABA in that way, and always through a strategic charitable purpose. For more information, you can always reach out to the terrific FJE staff or get the latest in our annual reports through their website at ambar.org/FJE, or just do a Google search, you'll find it. I have limited time today, so as a point of privilege, I want to share one message with you from my experience and use just one PowerPoint slide to support it. Perhaps one of the most cost-effective, powerful ways to support legal, whether through a legal program or even one whose primary focus is on housing or jobs, we ask that you please consider a focus on strong pro bono coordination. And by strong, I mean that the project has a skilled, knowledgeable, and connected person to answer the phone and emails, talk with prospective clients, assess the case, and make placements with the best chance of success. Because solid coordinators don't just connect us, they synchronize the legal community in support of the people your program would serve. Roughly every 10th job lawyers handle is pro bono, and there is a patchwork in most communities of legal aid offices, public defenders, law school clinics, bar associations, incubator programs, and the like. What the legal community sometimes struggles with ourselves is securing a person to connect us across town, across disciplines, and even across state lines when that's where a legal issue leads. Our own diversity, in other words, sometimes separates us, which is both frustrating and can unfortunately undermine our success, which means undermine the client's success. And let me show you why this matters. Slide up. This is a confusing slide. If you are not accustomed to the legal community, don't worry about that. This is a Venn diagram produced among a couple dozen national organizations serving veterans, and we were doing a gap analysis. What I want you to get from this are that these inside the circles are the legal issues. Around the outside are some of the stakeholders who provide solutions. But in each one of these circles, these are different arenas of law handled by different lawyers in different practice areas. And even within those circles, the issues themselves are diverse, and providers sometimes specialize only in a few. Yet in real life, many clients come in with a known legal issue, one or two that they're not aware of yet, and there may be another that's waiting to surprise them in a few months if they're not prepared. These issues can fall into any of the three circles. Lawyers know that some legal problems also tend to clump together like cereal at the bottom of the bowl, and they know how to scan for them, triage them, and keep veterans moving upwards. And that's good because these issues aren't just annoying, but many of them on their own can operate as a total barrier to housing, employment, benefits, and services. And I'll just say, when you're talking about homeless veterans, you may as well just mush it all together. You're going to see it all. It gets sticky, and this is common. So now back to that lawyer diversity challenge. No one provider is a panacea, so the need to coordinate and connect is vital. The stronger a pro bono coordinator is, the less significant the circles are, and it turns the diversity of legal providers from a frustration to our greatest strength. Even today, clients and their lawyers addressing legal issues in more than one state run into a wall for the inability to navigate referrals outside of their own community. Some local providers do this very well, however, and so I'm glad to see that Antonia is part of the program today to talk about that. And similar diagrams and analyses just like this one can be drawn for other legal arenas. So somebody once asked me, how does the legal community view funders? And despite some doing very well and the success of programs under outlets and connectors like FJE, I don't really know the answer, but I do know that many projects and programs don't know you're out there. And that's partly on our hands, and even sometimes for benign reasons. Laudable things like lawyer modesty over how they volunteer their time, or that legal aid isn't looking for recognition, can render us invisible to those who need help and to good people like yourselves. All I can offer right now is I'm sorry for the ways we don't get it right, but we're here, we're listening, and I'm looking forward to making that question mute, if you'll help. In closing, Teddy Roosevelt once said, the great reward in life is getting to work hard for things worth working hard for. Personally, I think it gets even better when we can do that work together. Thank you for your attention. Mary?
Yeah, thank you, Ken. This is Mary again, and we will also have a slide at the end of the session that will lay out a lot of these resources. Ken was referring to some, I've referred to some, and so please don't be overly confused right now. We hope that'll clarify further what our remarks have generally tried to do for you. So moving on to the second part of our session, we thought it'd be good to talk about why and how foundations that we know about are funding in this area, and we hope others on the call can add to the discussion beyond our speakers. The role and value of civil legal aid is pretty much hidden to us, I think, in philanthropy and also to the broader public. Our foundation, along with the Kresge Foundation, sponsored some public opinion research. And it showed that although 36% of those people polled had never heard of civil legal aid, once they had a sense of what we were talking about, as many as 82% of the public expressed strong support for it, believing that we must ensure everybody has legal help in these civil matters, regardless of their income. So it's one of the best kept secrets in the public and in philanthropy, but we wanted to say what we think the value is of civil legal aid to philanthropy. Why do we think funders maybe should take a look at it and think about partnering with those who are in civil legal aid in all our communities? So our slide really tries to suggest this, and we've laid out 3 reasons there. Civil legal aid first can be a really significant grant-making tool to help funders so that they can get outcomes they want in their programs. It gives funders an opportunity to make progress on social services areas, on policy areas, whether it's affordable housing, whether it's access to health care, hunger, education of children, income security. It's really a complementary strategy to increase impact. Just as in a couple of examples, if a funder, for example, cares about domestic violence, a major study has been done which shows that increased provision of legal aid for victims of domestic violence was one of the 3 primary causes for a marked decline in domestic violence during the 1990s. Or if you care about homelessness, many studies show that tenants fully represented in eviction cases are much more likely to be able to stay in their home. A second reason, civil legal aid really can provide multiple ways to help us in philanthropy reach our goals. If you're a funder who likes to do individual services in your community, you can turn to civil legal aid. If you are seeking broader impact or ways to influence public policy, you can also turn to legal aid. Civil legal aid lawyers see problems faced by low-income people, and then they try to sort of aggregate up to create broader advocacy strategies to advance our goals. And finally, just to say, I think that we as funders often are looking for ways to leverage our philanthropic dollars, and we can really complement or attract federal and state money and build public-private partnerships that are run by civil legal aid groups. In terms of fiscal impact, social return on investment studies in at least 27 states have shown that legal aid programs are bringing in millions of dollars, largely in federal benefits that really help people in the states, SSI and disability and Medicaid and veterans and more. It really helps with our safety net. And so bottom line is funders can really help leverage some of those dollars. So now we'll go on to hear some more specifics from the rest of our speakers. And I guess we turn now to Sean Morehead, correct, Laura?
Sean?
Hi.
Great.
Yep, here I am. So thank you, Mary. As you all, I'm sure, can gather, Mary is quite a leader in the civil legal aid field among foundations. So it's a real pleasure to hear you speak, Mary, and I'm going to try to avoid being redundant of what Mary said so that the folks on the call and webinar don't start checking their email on me. But I'm a program officer at the New York Community Trust. We are a community foundation that serves primarily the 5 boroughs of New York City. And we have had a long-standing program that we call Human Justice that has provided substantial support for civil legal aid here in New York City. And I thought it might be interesting just to briefly talk about how that came about, because it's very consistent with what the speakers before me have mentioned. As we were bringing dockets to the board in all of our different program areas, whether it was hunger, whether it was homelessness, whether it was domestic violence among girls and young women, frankly, whether it was workforce development and job preparation, we were finding that embedded within those programs were consistently grants to provide civil legal aid for New Yorkers who were affected by hunger and homelessness or domestic violence, or who were looking for a job. And so given how frequently that was showing up as a part of most of my colleagues' programs at the Trust, our president decided to create a specific human justice program focusing on civil legal aid across all of these program areas. And I hope that that just illustrates that civil legal aid is really a part of all of these different important priorities for many of our foundations, and that even beyond it being a part of that, it also in and of itself is worth thinking about as a funding strategy. So the slides I have for you today are actually excerpted from our human justice grant making strategy. These are not, necessarily the right thing for every foundation who wants to fund in these areas. But if you're at all like me, sometimes it's nice to have something that you can look at and agree with or disagree with, rather than try to create something whole cloth. So this first slide, and Laura, we can move through this quickly, you'll notice is essentially a copy of Mary's materials from Natural Allies, but again reinforcing who needs legal help. And one thing I wanted to add and say is that research has found that most low-income individuals and families often encounter 2 or 3 legal problems in a year. So making legal help part of any programmatic strategy is a critical piece, because it keeps coming up over and over again. So Laura, hitting the next slide. This just reinforces what Mary also said about the lack of representation in civil cases. So in New York, only 1 out of every 100 tenants who are being evicted from their apartments actually have a lawyer. And defendants in consumer credit cases have a lawyer less than 5% of the time. So although we often think about people heading to court with their lawyer in the pinstripe suit heading up the courthouse steps, in fact, the vast majority of time, poor people in civil cases are going to court with no legal help. This is also true in immigration proceedings. So heading to the next slide, Laura. This shows what some of the arguments that I often hear in favor of funding for civil legal aid, and they focus primarily on economics. So when you have legal representation, you save money on services for domestic violence victims, you save money spent on shelter costs, you bring in additional federal benefits for your state's low-income families. And so these kinds of financial benefits to civil legal aid really justify some of the government spending. And as you're thinking about this as part of your overall strategies, it can save money on emergency services and make room for more preventive services. Now, one thing that I think often keeps civil legal aid providers from being able to get grants from foundations is that, and I say this having been a formal civil legal aid lawyer, we don't often talk about the human impact of the work that we do. And we think very much about one lawyer for one client and how we, representing that individual client, can make a difference and, frankly, win the case. But the belief is that the legal representation actually has a much broader effect and much greater benefit for the clients beyond just winning the case. And this is, I think, a sweet spot for many foundations to try to find a way to help legal service agencies tell their story in a much more human term instead of making it about cases won and people represented. So the second little piece that I have highlighted there is to think about what kinds of legal services are actually most effective, when is legal representation most valuable, and when is some brief advice going to be as effective. And I think those are questions that foundations are comfortable trying to figure out answers to in other areas and can be an appealing place in civil legal aid as well. So heading to the next slide, this is just a little bit about the New York Community Trust's grant-making program and a few things that I'll highlight on that page. We have done a fair amount of representation for undocumented immigrant youth who were eligible for deferred action for childhood arrivals. This allowed them to get driver's licenses, to complete their educations, and to get work authorization, so that rather than working off the books, they were able to work on the books, pay their taxes, get better jobs, and really contribute to our city. We've also made grants around digital tools that Mary mentioned. How can we use technology to help those 99 tenants who are going into housing court on their own? And then we also have looked at problem-solving courts here in New York, so courts that are targeted to specific populations, such as those with mental illness or sex workers, and how we can help with wraparound services. And so that's the other thing that I wanted to highlight, was that legal aid is an important component of any strategy. And as legal aid lawyers are working with other social service providers, there's potential to really bring struggling families into more stable situations. And so they often are pairing with other social service providers. So going to the next slide, these are just some trends that we identified as we were working on revising this strategy this spring. And as Mary pointed out, federal funds for civil legal aid have fallen. Here in New York, we've been quite lucky that state and local government has stepped in and provided some additional resources, obviously not enough to meet the full demand. But in other places, this is not the case. And for example, I know in Illinois, there's been a substantial reduction in state funding for civil legal aid. So while we are thinking about what does it mean that you've got government funding and how do you figure out how to make the best of it, there is certainly in many places room to think about how you just simply get adequate funding for civil legal aid in your state. And then the next piece is really what I mentioned before, helping legal service providers think about how they best use the resources that they have, how they choose their cases, what kind of service they provide to their clients, and making those choices in ways that are likely to lead to the best outcomes. So our full strategy is a couple slides away. Laura, you want to skip the next slide and go to the final one? And this really, well, these were our findings and conclusions, and these were our guidelines. So the final slide are our grant-making guidelines for human justice, which I put out there just as something to think about and begin to figure out how you might or might not want to include this in your foundation's grant-making going forward. So the full strategy is on our website, and as you can tell, I feel really passionate that civil legal aid is an important part of many of the broader social improvements that our foundations are working to achieve. And so I hope this is helpful. And again, I thank my colleagues for participating. So with that, I'll hand it back to Mary.
And I'll hand it over to Laura.
Thank you so much, Sean, for sharing the New York Community Trust's very thoughtful and very comprehensive way of looking at this issue and thinking about how to fund it. I know so many foundations are thinking about, if I fund legal aid, what is that going to mean? It's a little bit different than how we think about maybe other grants. And so the amount of information and amount of work your team has put in to this and the passion that you bring to the project is very helpful to the field. Now for a private foundation, actually a family foundation expert to come in and to explain to us what they're doing in funding legal aid will help us get a balance about how both community foundations and private foundations are both equally passionate in this space and equally excited about doing this type of funding. So I'd like to introduce Frank Lally. He is doing a great deal of help for us today. He's actually pinch hitting for one of his colleagues, and we really want to appreciate him. He's from the May and Stanley Smith Charitable Trust. And Frank, I want to hand it over to you.
Great, thank you very much, and thanks so much for including us in this presentation. I want to acknowledge how distinguished my colleagues are and fellow presenters, so thank you. We are a private foundation based in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we fund in 14 Western United States. Veterans and military families is one of our 4 program areas. Our other areas are elders, adults with disabilities, and foster youth. And in each of these areas, we have grants to legal services providers and organizations because we recognize that legal services are really an important strategy to accomplish our grant-making goals. We are a responsive grant maker, and the majority of our grants are direct services grants, but we also do fund efforts at systems change, and legal services programs are really integral to both types of services and grants. I want to focus on our veteran and military families grant making and explain a little bit about how we got there. The Trust engaged in a strategic plan in 2013, and veterans and military families emerged as one of the populations that we felt needed some grant making attention and philanthropic support. And we funded a needs assessment to try to determine what the most important needs were among the veterans and military families in our service area. Legal services emerged as an important area of need as part of that needs assessment. The receipt of VA medical benefits as well as other benefits may require pursuing a claim in the VA's administrative adjudication system. And this is a really important issue for a lot of returning veterans. About an estimated 23% of veterans leave the service with a less than honorable discharge. And discharge status is very complicated. It has a lot of consequences in terms of the receipt or eligibility for veterans benefits. And upgrading discharges can involve pursuing legal remedies through each of the branches of the service or the Veterans Administration. So the upgrade success rate is quite low, even with the help of a lawyer, and it's simply something that requires legal assistance to obtain meaningful outcomes. In addition, while I know that the focus of today is on civil legal services, I just want to mention that some veterans find themselves caught up in the justice system, and that is another area where legal services are absolutely indispensable. So our veterans program area has 4 different goals: improving the mental health of veterans, helping with access to employment and education, housing stability, and community integration of veterans returning from the services. So legal issues cut across all 4 of these areas. Certainly eligibility for VA medical benefits relates to mental health. So does eligibility for income maintenance benefits, a VA pension, if you will, for things like maintaining housing. Access to education and employment. If you're not eligible for educational benefits under the GI Bill because of a less than honorable discharge, you can see that there's a legal issue related to that. And finally, for a number of veterans, integrating back into the community is certainly even more challenging when they are in a status that's considered less than honorable when leaving the military. So how do we do this, and what kinds of organizations do we fund? Principally in the veterans area, we're looking at legal services organizations that are freestanding and that provide services to a variety of different clients, including veterans. And as an example of that, I would mention our grantee, the Inner City Law Center in Los Angeles, which serves veterans and has a particular focus on people who are homeless. So for them, providing legal services to veterans is a homelessness prevention strategy. And then the other piece is that they are able to, by obtaining access to things like veterans benefits, they are able to enhance the quality of life for the veterans and for military families. That's an important goal of our grant making as a foundation overall. Sometimes there are veteran serving organizations that have legal services programs, and an example of that is an organization in San Francisco called Swords to Plowshares, which provides services around claims for medical and VA benefits and also discharge upgrades. And they also work to influence public policy around veterans' legal issues. Then there are two legal clinics that we are currently working with. One is at the University of San Diego School of Law, and they are focusing on the abuse of GI Bill educational benefits and also starting to work on discharge upgrades. The Law College at the University of Arizona has law students embedded in veterans courts in the justice system, helping veterans with misdemeanors participate in programs that are alternative or diversionary to incarceration or fines. And I would mention that in the case of both Swords to Plowshares, the veteran serving organization, and the Inner City Law Center, both of these organizations rely upon and have particularly robust pro bono legal services programs. So they are able to magnify their impact by working with lawyers in the private bar to represent clients who they would otherwise not be able to serve. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Rizzo from the Department of Veterans Affairs, and Antonia Vanilli, who actually works in legal aid. And the reason that they're with us today is that William is going to go into the details about, if you're looking at funding veterans, what do we know that really helps them in legal aid? The Department of Veterans Affairs has been able to actually say these are the concentrated areas. So we're going to have William speak to us, and then Antonia is going to explain some of the impact of funding legal aid in the work that they do. We're so happy to not only have the foundations with us today, but many of our partners here on the webinar who can really talk about the ripple effects of foundations getting involved in this work. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to William Rizzo.
Thanks very much. So the first slide, veteran homelessness in the U.S., I'll describe kind of the scope of the main problem that we're focusing on with legal services, and it's a mixed story here, good news and bad news. On any single night in 2010, there were about 75,000 homeless veterans due to several programs, some government, some non-government. That number has fallen to under 50,000. So there's been a 33% decrease over the last 5 years. And that's been a big, there's been a big emphasis by the Obama administration and the VA in doing that, in reaching that goal. I want to just mention, though, it's obvious to anyone that reads the newspaper that VA can't do it all, can't provide all the services and benefits that veterans need. I was a legal aid attorney before joining VA, and I can tell you that even during years when VA is functioning at full capacity with full resources and very efficiently, there's areas in veterans' lives that VA doesn't have the ability or the statutory authority to address. And homelessness is an area, and specifically unmet legal needs are a great example of an area that VA simply cannot address, and we need collaboration with the private sector to do that. Next slide. VA does an annual survey of veterans who are currently homeless or previously homeless, as well as service providers. And year after year, 4 of the top unmet needs are legal needs: eviction foreclosure, child support, outstanding warrants and fines, and restoring driver's license. And then there's other unmet needs that have a legal aspect. So these are reasons why veterans become homeless and stay homeless. And that's consistent in our research year after year. Over the last few years, VA has started collaborating with the nonprofit sector and with pro bono attorneys nationwide. And one of the main things we've done is simply open our doors to legal aid providers. Had never been done before. And once we did that in 2011, there was a huge influx of support and assistance and desire to help veterans from all aspects of the legal community: private firms, legal aid organizations, law schools. And as a result, we now have 85 free legal clinics functioning in VA medical facilities, and they're very successful and have been very helpful to the veterans in those communities. Next slide. Okay, next, one more. We're also working with the nonprofit community to just educate legal aid providers on the needs of veterans. Discharge upgrades that Frank just mentioned is a major area, especially with veterans coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. And that's an area where veterans absolutely need legal assistance and support. It's a technical, complex field. Going to the next slide. We're working with the American Bar Association to kind of harness the influx of pro bono attorneys and to represent veterans in VA claims. And we've been doing a pilot project for the last 2 years that has been very successful in providing pro bono assistance to veterans trying to get VA benefits. The next slide, I'll just give one kind of case study example. We've worked quite a bit with the very large law firm DLA Piper, and they have a legal clinic in the Philadelphia area. And they've described this story to us. Eric, Iraq veteran, who was actually expelled from college for not providing his medical records, which had a lot of sensitive information about his treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder. DLA was successful in fighting that expulsion and actually helping him transfer to another college. And while he was attending college, he was homeless, lived in a tent, and yet managed to get very good grades and to graduate from college. That's the kind of situation where the pro bono legal assistance has a direct impact and help this veteran turn his life around. And I just want to close out with the point that our secretary, who's been in office for about a year, Secretary Bob McDonald, comes from a corporate background. He was CEO of Procter & Gamble, and he has emphasized the need for public-private partnerships. And so VA has kind of been unleashed, staff like myself to form partnerships and relationships with trade associations like ABA, nonprofit legal service providers, foundations, and so on. And these are remarks that our secretary made to the Council on Foundations on May 12th at their conference. And his point is that VA is now in a mode where, partly out of necessity, as I mentioned earlier, we're ready, willing, and able to form alliances and partnerships with the private sector and nonprofit community to support the needs of veterans. And I'll be happy to answer any questions or provide any information after we're done. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bill. And now we have
Antonia Vanilli.
Yes, I was going to say, now we have Antonia Vanilli, the Executive Director of Homeless Persons Representation Project, and we're excited to have her with us because she's actually going to talk about the front lines of this work and what your investment as foundations does when we invest in this work. So, Antonia, please take it away.
Absolutely, and it's a real honor to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I am very conscious of the hour, and because my wonderful colleague Bill Rizzo has given you an excellent overview of what the VA has done to partner with legal services programs, including bring them into their VA facilities, I will refer you to the first 4 slides of my PowerPoint presentation, which are really quite self-explanatory. I'm going to skip over them and actually move on to my next slide that's titled Impact of Legal Services. I was asked to prepare some slides actually supporting one of the points that my colleague Sean Morehead made about legal services organizations needing to look at the long-term impact of the legal services they offer. And as a legal services provider, I agree with her that legal services do focus nearly entirely on the immediate outcome of the legal cases that we provide, and often do not look at the long-term impacts of the legal services on the lives of our clients. And primarily, I think that's because the major funders, be it the Legal Services Corporation for the federally funded programs or some of the state IOLTA funders, do not require that kind of outcome reporting and do require significant immediate case outcome reporting. And so all the resources currently at legal services organizations are really directed at immediate case outcome reporting. But the Homeless Persons Representation Project, which is based in Baltimore, Maryland, and whose mission is to end homelessness in Maryland by providing legal representation, education, and advocacy for people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness, did see a benefit to actually looking at the long-term impact of some of our cases several years ago. And so I have for you in this slide the results of a study we did of clients who came through our program for legal representation in expunging their criminal records. Expungement is a civil legal process in the state of Maryland, even though you're expunging a criminal record. It's a civil process. It is a type of legal service that actually lends itself very well to pro bono legal representation. The average hours donated by volunteer attorneys in our program are about 2 to 3 per client in the expungement program. It's a wonderful way to get volunteer lawyers involved in work. And we offer legal services, as we do in many other areas, in community-based facilities. Next slide. So we actually handle hundreds of expungement cases every year, But in 2009, we were very lucky to be awarded a grant from United Way of Central Maryland to provide expungement legal representation in a number of community-based facilities and to conduct a long-term outcomes study of the folks who are represented through that particular grant project. We knew that we did a very good job as lawyers representing our clients, and in fact 95% of the expungement petitions we filed were granted. So we felt like very good lawyers. The question really was, were our clients employed at the end of that process? And so we conducted phone surveys. This was not a very scientific survey, but this is what we were able to do with our staffing. We conducted phone surveys of folks who were represented over a year and a half and had at least one order granting expungement by June 2011. We can go to the next slide. I have some information about the demographics here of who were contacted. We reached out to nearly 80 clients and had just over half respond to it, which was good. We're talking about clients who had about 238 petitions filed, so they had about three eligible charges per client could be removed from their records. And we'll move to the next slide. And I will just say that the purpose of looking at the data for expungement, we know that criminal records are a significant barrier to employment for our clients. And we knew that that barrier seemed even taller during the recession. And so when we were surveying our clients to see if the expungement had impact, we wanted to see if they had gotten jobs. And in fact, even in this incredibly poor economy that Baltimore was experiencing in 2010 and 2011 as the nation was, nearly half of our clients were actually able to find jobs within 6 months after having their record expunged. This was really important data for us. We knew that anecdotally this was true. We knew that a couple of individual cases, we knew folks were getting jobs. But to know that nearly half actually were able to get jobs within 6 months, even in a bad economy, told us that the impact of our legal work was going to be significant, and in a stronger economy, that percentage was going to go up a lot more. I have some client statements about the effect that legal representation had on them. And I'll just note the first bullet is a client who actually said that the legal representation, the 2 to 3 hours that he received from a pro bono lawyer actually saved his life. He was so depressed from his unemployment that someone who could just take away that barrier and clear his record really helped him turn his life around, and he was able to get a job. I just have a couple of considerations on the next slide. As I said, legal services programs, I think, by and large, are not funded to conduct these kinds of studies. This was really done as part of a one-time grant. But our organization really does recognize the value of these kinds of studies, and we're trying to look at ways to develop staffing to conduct the studies, including reaching out to a local social work school to bring on social work interns. So we're really trying to do it with free help. And that's because we have a social work school here. But I think for organizations that are in other parts of the country where there's no social work school or no necessarily available help to be able to do a study like this, they really are going to need the support of foundations to be able to get the staffing for this. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I really appreciate it.
Antonia, thank you so much. We're going to turn it over to Mary because there's a few legal resources that we want to highlight for you all, and then we're going to get into your questions. We actually have had one question over and over again, so we can't wait to get to it. Thank you all for staying with us. I know a lot of people tend to, come off these calls halfway through, and you all have stayed on the whole time, and you're not dropping, so we're so excited that you're as excited as we are as panelists to talk to you about this. So Mary, if you want to highlight the resources.
Well, I was just going to note that in the Natural Allies publication, it sort of lays out what other funders are doing to help with legal aid in their various communities. You might want to take a peek at that. We wrote about that as well in the Chronicle of Philanthropy. The Legal Aid Toolkit is something that the federal government developed because they've been working very hard at the Justice Department to bring in other federal agencies to help fund legal aid. The Voices for Civil Justice is a new communications tool that a lot of groups around the country are using to try to get the word out about civil legal aid. And then the next four really, and Ken had mentioned one of them, the next four are really places that you could turn to that would list a lot of legal groups and helpful thinkers on this subject in your local community. So you might want to take a peek at some of those. I also just wanted to add that Antonia mentioned the legal services groups often aren't measuring as they really need to be their outcomes. And in fact, now the Legal Services Corporation is going to develop a full toolkit to help their groups and groups all across the country, because it will be open source, to help them figure out how to measure outcomes. There'll be a big toolkit that will be developed, and they'll be requiring it of their legal services groups to actually develop some kind of an outcome measurement system. So it's just an example really of something that everybody could fund in their local communities to help legal aid groups be stronger at this outcome measurement and so forth. So just wanted to highlight that too.
Thank you so much, Mary. We're going to get into the questions now. As you all start to type yours in, I wanted to say thank you all for this. We're going to continue this conversation on the Philanthropy Exchange and have slides and the legal resources sent to everyone who participated, and then also put up on the Philanthropy Exchange for the conversation to continue. I have to tell you personally, I came from a community foundation in Indiana where expungement became an opportunity while we were there, except that there was a one chance and done rule. So if you did it wrong the first time, you were out. And that was a really scary thing to cope with and think about for our foundation. And so hearing everyone talk today about expungement and domestic issues, veterans, thinking about funding legal aid is actually a way about thinking about some of the most core and systemic issues and how we as foundations get involved in those in our communities. And I'm so excited that we heard numerous examples of that today, and not just about the foundation funding, but then how that funding carried through to true impact. So our first question, if you all stay with us, we'll start these, but we understand if you all have your next meeting to go to. The first question, we had it in numerous ways, was people asking, when you fund legal aid as a foundation, do you usually fund a legal services organization or an individual's legal fees? And they're asking, you know, especially because employee relief, disaster relief, clearing title of property are things that people are hearing about in their communities, and sometimes that seems like an individual issue rather than a legal service organization. So Mary, if you'd like to start, and then maybe Sean, if you had anything to add to that.
Well, I would think that typically foundations probably can and should fund the legal aid groups that actually give the help, because then they can help a whole lot of people. And you know, you can tell them, we need you to work on expungement, we need you to work on housing, whatever it is. But I think legal aid groups are really able to look at the problem and then help a lot of people through the aid that the foundation would give.
Great. Sean, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I agree with Mary. I think, well, I have a couple of small things I'd add. I agree you want to fund the civil legal service providers who are going to work for multiple clients at no cost, or sometimes they will charge a very nominal fee to the client. And remember that those take many different shapes. So it can be the civil legal aid lawyer actually representing the client. It can also be the civil legal aid lawyer supporting several private attorneys who are offering their time for free representing the client. So there are different formats that the service delivery can take, but you want the money to go to those legal aid providers, not to reimburse individual attorneys.
Great. That's very helpful, because the follow-up question that we have to that is, if a foundation does fund legal bills for citizens, is that considered income to that person for taxable purposes? Did anyone want to take a shot at that question, or should we just reinforce fund legal aid organization? Sean, did you have any comment? Go ahead.
I would avoid the tax advice and just say fund legal aid.
Okay.
I mean, we have had a couple of situations where a nonprofit will hire an attorney to provide the representation to the individuals they serve, but it's the nonprofit paying the fees, not the foundation paying the fees, and it's just a part of the nonprofit's larger service delivery program.
Antonia, did you have anything to add to that?
I do not.
Okay, great. So our third question is a question about whether a foundation can support expert witnesses, specifically in mental health cases that might be for the public good, especially regarding involuntary treatment. Did anyone want to tackle that one?
I don't think.
I'll give that one a go. And wait, am I covering up somebody else?
No, go ahead.
So we do have grants that we have made to legal service providers that include court costs for the litigation, and I would think that expert witness fees would be among the potential court costs. Now you want to be careful, right, because those can be extremely expensive. So you want to look at that in any budget you get on a proposal to see whether court costs are included and how much they are, and you want to ask those questions about what kinds of costs. But we do consider those in kind of an other program cost.
I would add that I think some foundations will fund individual pieces of litigation. Let's say the legal aid group is suing for something in the area of housing or something in the area of medical care, and it's a big piece of litigation that's going to help a lot of clients, sometimes called a class action. And in those cases, I think a foundation often can help pay for the legal fees, help pay for the court costs and the like.
Great. One of our last questions, how can legal professionals and law students help grantees to facilitate the funding process? So, Antonia, do you have a thought about this, or maybe Ken, about how we can all be working together as people come to funders? And that's actually a question from a funder, probably asking about how they can help people who are coming to them in different pieces.
Sure. So I will just share that we actually engage law students in pretty significant ways in our legal services program. Law students volunteer at our community-based legal clinics, which is a great opportunity for them to get out of law school and get into the community and see law in real life. And we have engaged them in a couple of different ways as we have raised money for our program. There are some very small foundations in Baltimore that have funded the particular law student engagement piece of our program, and so we've had them support that particular process. I wasn't sure if the question was more focused on having law students support fundraising for legal services programs. Other than the example I just mentioned, we have not had them engaged in that. Ken, I don't know if you have anything to add.
I can wait until after we're kind of at the end of time. I would just say law schools are an excellent place. Incubators working in a lot of different spaces with a lot of flexibility in how they address issues. The ABA has a section of legal education that includes all the law schools, and we're very happy to make referrals and make connections, but they already work in some spaces with program and community groups around given areas. I know, for example, in the veteran space, there's certainly, I think, over 24 now, and there's also a kind of a national coalitions that work around given issues, and there is, of course, an association of clinical programs at law schools that we're very happy to connect people to.
Great. So we're getting a lot of questions on here about more, how to access resources and how to evaluate this type of work. So we're going to make sure that we give that to you in the email that we send after, as well as continuing this conversation in the Philanthropy Exchange. In addition, we see numerous individuals on the call asking about these grants to individuals for legal services. We're going to take that offline, and we're going to come back to you with some really targeted bullet points on this information because it's such a hot topic among the questions, and we thank you, but we want to give you a really strong and solid response to that, not just it's better to do legal services, but what are actually some of the legalities getting into of funding individuals? I also wanted to say that there is a group of funders in the San Francisco Bay Area that have created the Legal Services Funder Network, and there's already 20 organizations participating. It's a broad section of private foundations, community foundations, corporate foundations, law firms, individuals, crowdsourced funders, and government, and they welcome participation by others. LSFN at one-justice.org is the information. We're going to include that with the resources, and we want to thank Claire Salat, who's on the call with us today, and James Head for bringing this information to our attention and finding one more way that we can connect all of you who are excited about this work to the work moving forward. So please know this conversation is one piece of the puzzle about how we want to connect with you, and we're going to keep looking for ways to do that. We will try to get to those unanswered questions, and we thank you so much for joining us today. The slides, the recording, more resources, and answers to your question will be available in the email and again on the Philanthropy Exchange. So thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you to all of our panelists. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you to the council.
Thank you.